Welcome to Little Notes and Big Questions. I'm Lindsay Schreiber. In this series, we've been taking a look at some of society's biggest issues through the lens of God's Word and developing an apologetic, a systematic, rational defense of what we believe. This video is the last of the societal issues we're going to cover in this Little Notes program before we move on to our next segment, which is going to explore the Bible. How did we get the Bible as we know it today? Why are some books excluded? And how do we answer what are sometimes seen as contradictions in the Bible? I'm excited for that portion of this series to come up. Before tonight, we are finishing out this societal, ethical conversation on the subject of polygamy. I chose polygamy because it is gaining acceptance in our society. More and more we hear of young people who think that open relationships are a good idea, and even in Christian circles sometimes there's question of how can we say that it's wrong, particularly because the Bible has so many instances not only of polygamy, but also that polygamy was coming from some of our heroes of the faith. How do we answer that question? Are we hypocrites for saying that marriage is one man for one woman for life, when so many of the leaders in the Bible had multiple wives? That's our subject tonight. To get started, I want to cover some terms because some of these can get confusing, and I want to make sure that we're all on the same page as we move forward. Monogamy is defined as being married to one person at a time. The church believes that marriage is meant for one man for one woman for life, a monogamous relationship with no other parties involved. Polyamory is being involved in multiple romantic, often sexual relationships at a time. Polyamory would be a group that is dating, not necessarily married. Sometimes polyamory can be called ethical non-monogamy. Sometimes you'll hear open relationships, which would be a little bit different from the true definition of polyamory, because often open relationships denotes a hookup culture, that there are people who are coming in and out of that relationship just for sexual means. But in polyamory, generally that means what they would consider a committed relationship, in the sense that they are in a long-term relationship with someone, except it's someone's, that there are other people involved. Polyamory becomes polygamy when marriage enters the picture. Polygamy is being married to multiple people simultaneously. Types of polygamy include polygyny, which is one man with multiple wives; polyandry, one woman married to multiple husbands; and group marriage, which is multiple people being intermarried. Usually polygamy is consensual and it has a religious base. That might seem a little bit odd, but remember, we're talking worldwide numbers of polygamy. And generally people in polyamorous relationships are the ones who are not religious because they're not looking to be married. A lot of times they don't see any purpose of marriage because they already feel like they're committed. But polygamy generally has that religious undertone. And polygamy involves 3 or more people. This differs from a similar term, bigamy. Bigamy means someone is marrying one person while they are still legally married to another person. Bigamy is usually secretive or deceptive. Generally, in bigamy cases, someone, and I'm going to keep using the term man, it could be a woman, of course, but generally, statistically, it's men. In bigamy, generally a man may already have a wife, and he marries another wife, and the first wife doesn't know he's getting married again, and the second wife doesn't know that he's already got another wife that he's not legally divorced from. That's technically bigamy. It would be like if when I married my husband, he said, hey, I've got a work trip and I'm going to be gone for a couple months after we get back from our honeymoon. And then I find out later, the couple months he went back to his family that I didn't know anything about. That is bigamy. Bigamy involves 3 people, and usually at least one person does not know that they are involved in this type of relationship. They don't realize they're in a polygamous relationship. Because in polygamy, it would be consensual. Everyone would be agreeing to do this, but in bigamy, generally only one person in that triad knows what's happening. Bigamy is illegal in all 50 states, but the punishment varies from low misdemeanors to felonies. Generally, if you have heard anything about polygamy, like in social media or in TV shows, reality shows, you'll hear about bigamy charges. Polygamists can be brought up on a bigamy charge. That's usually the statute that you hear polygamists charged under, even if they are technically in a polygamous relationship. They will be called a bigamist for the sake of legal purposes. And the reason that bigamy is what is illegal is because it involves deception and secrets. So, like I said in that scenario before, the woman who didn't know there was another wife, she's being deceived. Or the woman who thinks she has a husband is deceived when he goes and takes on another wife. So that's why it's illegal, because of the deception. So then the question becomes, okay, but if polygamy is not deceptive, and if in a polygamous relationship everybody's okay with it, why would we care? Why do we care what adults do in their bedrooms? That's the argument we've heard in several of these ethical issues. Well, the government cares about polygamous relationships for a few reasons. One, because it undermines our legal system. In the American judicial system, if you don't be married to somebody anymore, you got to get a divorce. You got to get a legal divorce before you can marry somebody else. And the other thing that's tied to the legal system is the matter of custody. If we were to open up those floodgates that you could be married to 4 or 5 women, and then let's say you had maybe 15 kids, and then everything falls apart, as these relationships often do, everyone goes their separate ways. Think about the legal turmoil of having to figure out who are the legal parents of all of these children, because that's going to lead to things like child support, and to custody, and to visitation. It would really tie up our judicial system and our civil system if we began to endorse and allow these kind of relationships. Another thing that comes up is the subject of immigration fraud. So if we started to allow bigamy, or we started to allow men to have multiple wives, think about someone who could maybe be paid to marry a woman and help her gain legal status. There's a lot of people out there that would have no problem with doing that, and they could make a whole lot of money, and they could have a whole lot of wives before it was over with if we began to permit this. So that's another concern on the government side of why we care about what, quote, consenting adults do in their bedroom. Another issue I went into in depth in the live class, I'm not going to spend too much time on it here, is the subject of welfare fraud. It is something that gets brought up in the polygamy conversation a lot, because technically women can say that they are single mothers even if they're living communally with a man who makes a lot of money. They could be living very comfortably and still be getting government benefits, because generally these women don't have anything. They don't have anything in their names, and for them, that allows them to say that they don't have a lot of assets. It also means they're often trapped. And so on an ethical level, even if we weren't talking about the Bible, which we're going to get to soon, I have an issue with polygamy, even if we're just talking about in that department. I have a problem with the fact that it breeds an unfair environment for women. It often keeps women, particularly because of their religious ties, it keeps women in situations they can't get out of, that can be very emotionally and financially abusive to women, because they have no recourse, they have no way to escape. They're very much part, even if it's not, I know we don't like the word cult, but the families themselves could almost become cultish, because you have so many people weighing in on the decisions that you are making, and you should be able to make your own decisions. So to me, even if we're not even talking about the Bible, I think just as a woman, I have a hard time with the idea of our society accepting this sort of scenario and this sort of setup. And I would feel equally bothered if we were in a situation where we were talking about a woman taking on many husbands. I don't think that's right either, because there is going to be inequity, and I do think it's really bad for these kids for the reasons that I just shared. It's more complicated when things inevitably end, because generally they do end, and not in a pretty way. So that takes us to some statistics. 1 in 5 people in the US and Canada say they have been in an open relationship. A 2023 poll found that 1/3 of Americans described their ideal relationship as something other than complete monogamy. Something other than. I'm going to guess something other than was probably the person taking the poll said, well, I could cheat and they can't. I don't know. I don't have that fact. But 34% of Americans think the ideal relationship would involve not being fully faithful. Now, we had quite a discussion on this last night in our class, and concerns were shared, particularly by adults who could potentially end up dating, they said this is really scary that people don't want to have a faithful monogamous relationship. But the thing is, to a lot of people, particularly those who want to label this as ethical non-monogamy, they actually think they're being very ethical, because in their mind, they're binary choices that either a person is going to cheat and they'll do it behind your back, or they will be with someone else and they will tell you, and therefore that's not cheating. And that's really sad. And I think that 1/3 poll is scary because it shows how cynical Americans have become about love, that a lot of people truly believe it is impossible to be in a relationship and not cheat. So if it were me and I was in the dating pool, I think pretty early on I would begin to ask questions like, what do you think about those kind of relationships? Because it's very telling. If someone says to you, well, I don't know that I would do it, but it makes sense because people cheat. Maybe vet that person a little bit more and see why they assume that every relationship involves infidelity. Next, we're going to talk about religious ties. Let's talk first about Islam. In Islam, polygamy is permitted according to the Quran 4:3. A Muslim man can marry up to 4 wives as long as he treats them equally. Polygamy is legal in most Muslim-majority countries like Iraq, Iran, and other parts of the Middle East, and almost all of Africa, where 1/3 of the population is Muslim. Now let's talk about the church here in America that gets the greatest association to polygamy. Early members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints practiced polygamy. The following is a quote from the official website of the church. From the early 1840s to about 1890, in response to revelation given by the prophet Joseph Smith, leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints taught the practice of plural marriage, also called polygamy. If you don't know anything about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, sometimes called LDS, sometimes they're called Mormons because of their Book of Mormon. The church was founded by a man named Joseph Smith, whom they consider a prophet. They believe that he received these special revelations from God. Well, we're going to talk in just a minute about why polygamy was introduced in those early days, but I want to make it clear from the outset that this is not a practice of the mainstream Mormon church today. Also from their official source, in 1890, church president Wilford Woodruff received a revelation prompting him to issue a statement known as the Manifesto, which instructed the saints not to enter into more plural marriages. The ending of plural marriage took some time, but since the early 1900s, people who enter plural marriages or promote its practice cannot remain members of the church. It's an important distinction to know because they're still trying to shake that image. But I also want you to understand that it's a fair tie to the Mormons, or at least the early day of Mormonism, and particularly their leader, whom they still hold in very high respect. On why they even were participating in plural marriages to begin with, we know this, again, from their sources. The Book of Mormon, while prohibiting polygamy generally, explains that God sometimes commands it in order to raise up seed unto him. Plural marriage among the early saints did result in the birth of many children into faithful Latter-day Saint families in a relatively short time. This helped to strengthen the early church, and many Latter-day Saints today can trace their roots to those families. So essentially, they denounce the practice today, but they're still going to say, well, it served a really good purpose in the beginning because it was how they grew the church so quickly. Now, to understand how they end up practicing polygamy, we have to talk a little bit more about Joseph Smith. He gets a revelation probably around the early 1830s, but he didn't write it down till 1843. And in this revelation, he says that he was asking God why so many biblical figures had multiple wives. And he said that God told him because he commanded it. That's why, because God said so, and you do what God said. Well, Smith, by this point, had been married to his wife Emma for about 10 years, by the mid-1830s. And that's when God commands Joseph Smith to add a second wife, a young woman of 19 years old. But Smith was not done following the Lord's commands. The problem is that we don't know exactly how many wives Joseph Smith had. When you look at the work of historians, they keep increasing the number of wives that he had. But I'll go with the church's official statement, which states that by the time of his death in 1844, Joseph Smith had been sealed to over 30 women. So the sealing process is interesting. When I lived out west, they built a Mormon temple in the town that I lived in. And it got a lot of backlash from the community. It got so much backlash that in order to try to smooth things out, they had an open house in the Mormon temple that was built. And understand, temples are different than their churches. So their churches in neighborhoods, and they look like any other church, like a Christian church. But the temples are special because they're for special ceremonies. And so they did this open house, and I remember I was probably a young teenager at the time. When we went on the tour, you had to wear the shoe covers like you wear in an operating room to go through. Now, I don't know if this was the truth or not, but it was said that, it could have just been a hygiene thing. I don't know. And there was also a rumor that they recarpeted everything when it was over with. I don't know that either. I don't know if that's true or not, because people felt like it was because we were unholy coming into the temple, and that's entirely possible. They really felt that way, or it could have just been that they were trying to be clean with their super expensive temple. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. What I want you to hear from this is that on this tour, you were able to see a lot of the temple. I'm sure there are parts that we weren't permitted to see, but something of interest is that they have a sealing room that when someone is married, they go for the ceremony, and the husband and wife stand together in this room that has mirrors on both sides. The purpose of the mirrors, if you know what happens when you look at a mirror that's back to back like that, you're going to see the same reflection bouncing back and forth, and it seems to go on into eternity. They're making a point when someone is sealed that this is for eternity. Now, biblically, that doesn't stand because we're not married in heaven, but in the Mormon faith, they were making a point of, you're going to be in the celestial kingdom with your wife or wives in this case. So when they use that word sealing, that's what they're talking about. That's that commitment of being married. I find it particularly interesting that the church can't figure out how many times he was sealed, because that is an official ceremony that happens. You're not just talking about, well, maybe he went off with a parson and got married. I'm sure maybe it was different back then, but I just have a hard time believing they would not have had records, because Mormons are fantastic with the records, with their genealogy. And I went over that a little bit last night, that was another thing in the temple that was noticed because of their baptism procedures. And I don't know if this is standard everywhere, but I do know that some practice baptism for the dead, and so that's why they have to go back and research their ancestors. They need to know who they came from. So it's just hard for me to believe that a church that's so well known for their archiving skills wouldn't know how many times the founder was married. It doesn't much matter, I guess. But one resource I found, this was not from the LDS site, but from another resource I found from a Joseph Smith historian, said that of those more than 30 women that Joseph was sealed to, he had been sealed to 10 women who were under the age of 20, 4 were 19, 3 were 17, 1 was 16, and 2 were 14 years old. Mainstream Mormons, again, I want to repeat, do not practice polygamy today, but fundamentalist groups that split from the Mormons do. So there are a lot of fundamentalist groups, you hear about them from time to time in the news. They split off usually because of this issue. They want to get back to the days of Joseph Smith, who said that he had this revelation from God that they needed multiple wives. And that brings us to the last religion, and the one that really matters for us, Christianity and Judaism by default because of the Old Testament. What do we do with the fact that so many of highly regarded figures in the Bible had multiple wives? What do we do with that? Well, once again, let's go back to the start where we discussed God's plan for marriage. I've covered this in several videos, so I'm not going to cover it again. But we know, I will briefly discuss it at the end, but for right now, just remind you that we know that God made man and woman, that his design was for one man, for one woman, for life. Now, I'm not going to get into all that right now, but instead I want to jump right into a few examples. There are a lot of polygamous examples in the Bible, but I want to go over a few specifically in depth. The first instance of polygamy recorded, there may have been polygamists before this, but the first one recorded in the Bible is Lamech. in Genesis 4:19. This is Cain's great-great-great-great-grandson, and he takes 2 wives. Now, I want you to remember that Cain, he murders his brother Abel, and when Cain does that, it causes him to leave the presence of the Lord. Keep that in your mind. In Genesis 23 and 24, Lamech brags to his wives that he has murdered a man. So our first exposure to polygamy is a man who was raised outside of God's presence who brags about murder. Is this a positive influence for us? No, it's not a positive influence for us. And again, we're getting several generations past creation at this point before it's brought up that there is polygamy. If he is the first, it's pretty telling how far distance we got from someone in his family being in the presence of God, and this is where we end up. The next example is of Abraham. After God has promised Abram that he would have an heir from his own body. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go in to my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her." And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. And Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. So this is a little bit different situation, how we normally think of polygamy. In fact, most people don't even think about this as polygamy if they're just kind of casually thinking about the story. But the situation, the outcome is the same. Abram has 2 wives at this point. The patriarch of the faith has 2 wives. The word, when it says that Sarai gave the maid as his wife, it's the same wife word that we see other times in the Bible for what we would consider legitimate marriages. So however this happened, we obviously think of it in a surrogacy situation, but they didn't go to a fertility clinic. He was very much acting as he would with his wife to impregnate this woman, and she is recorded as a wife. So we have the patriarch of our faith with 2 wives. What are we ever going to do? Well, what we're going to do is see what was the result. The end result is jealousy, and we end up seeing abuse between these 2 women, and we see conflict that arises between the sons, Isaac and Ishmael, the wives' children. That conflict is continuing today because it is commonly held by Jews and Muslims and Christians that Ishmael is the father of the Arabs, the precursors to Muslims. So even today, when you see conflict between, for instance, in the Palestinian conflict between Jewish people and Muslims, we can thank that back to this really bad idea of a surrogate wife, of a polyamorous situation that resulted here, and it's still causing trouble today. Then we go to Genesis 29. Genesis 29, Jacob is tricked into marrying 2 sisters, Rachel and Leah. This creates conflict between the sisters. That rivalry leads to jealousy among their kids, ultimately leading to Leah's sons selling Rachel's son, Joseph, into slavery. That takes us through Genesis. And then you get to Deuteronomy, and we're getting to the giving of the law. So in Deuteronomy 17:17, there is law forbidding Israel's future king from polygamy. The word says, "Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away." That was from the Mosaic law. And then here comes King David, a man after God's own heart, and a man with a bunch of wives. The consequence of David taking on all of these wives is complete dysfunction, including his children, his son raping his daughter, and then his other son becoming very angry and rebellious over the whole thing, to the point that he eventually tries to usurp the throne. And as part of that, we end up seeing the fruition of prophecy that had been given to David back during the whole Bathsheba incident, that David was told what was going to happen, and it happens through Absalom when Absalom takes David's concubines to a roof and he has sex with them so that all of Israel can see it. So you see total dysfunction coming again out of a family where lust is just running wild and multiple wives are being taken. But the greatest proof of that warning against the kings that was given in the Mosaic Law, that happens in the life of David's son and the successor to the throne, King Solomon. Solomon ends up with 700 wives and 300 concubines. 1 Kings 11:1 records the ultimate destruction this causes. But King Solomon loved many foreign women as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonites, and Hittites, from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, "You shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods." Solomon clung to these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart. For it was so, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. Now, I'm going to caution to remind you of something really quickly. There are people who would say, well, Solomon's sin was not because he had a bunch of wives. Solomon's sin was because he intermarried with women from other lands, which is what was recorded there. But I'm going to make this argument that, number one, if he would have just listened to the Mosaic Law to start with, there would have been no risk of marrying women from other lands. And he could have just married one woman from another land, and it still would have been a problem. If you don't believe me, ask King Ahab, who married Jezebel. But the other issue here is that whether or not he married women who brought in other idols, the fact that he was treating women as this stable of animals that he had shows you he had already begun to idolize creation. He had sex at a much higher level than it ever deserved to be. So he was already an idol worshiper, in my opinion, because of what he had done with these women. Solomon ends up building high places for the worship of other gods where even child sacrifice took place. The Bible tells us very plainly, you can keep reading in that chapter, that this directly led to Israel being divided into two kingdoms. So one of the most traumatic things that happens to the land, where it has to be divided in half, the people are split, is a direct result from Solomon having all of these wives and concubines. So I've given you all of these examples, and none of them are good, and you're not going to find a good one. I didn't tell you every instance of polygamy in the Bible, but I can tell you it's not painted in a positive way. So that brings us to what is the simplest answer and applies in a lot of situations where you may be asked about the Bible, that there's a difference between something being prescriptive and descriptive. There is a difference in Scripture when it is prescribing what you should do versus what it is describing. The former is a command or an example of how to live. The latter is sharing information. Let's not forget that the Bible is a book of history. There is also poetry and law and prophecy, but we see history throughout the Bible. And so as a book of history, we're going to see factual information. It does not mean that everything recorded in the Bible has been endorsed by God or is supported for us to continue today. So if somebody says, well, Solomon had hundreds of wives, he was the wisest man and had hundreds of wives, so it has to be okay. Well, your answer back to that is, Solomon also made a way for child sacrifice. Are you sacrificing children at your house? Because that's recorded about him too, in the same passage. When somebody brings up polygamy in the Bible, just ask them how it worked out for those people, and I can almost guarantee you they're not going to know the answer. But now you know the answer. So that's your reward for tuning in today. Besides the descriptive portions of Scripture, there are other verses on the subject. Deuteronomy 21:15-17 records law from the Mosaic Law. If a man has two wives, one loved and the other unloved, and they have borne him children, both the loved and the unloved, and if the firstborn son is of her who is unloved, then it shall be on the day he bequeaths his possessions to his son that he must not bestow firstborn status on the son of the loved wife in preference to the son of the unloved, the true firstborn. But he shall acknowledge the son of the unloved wife as the firstborn by giving him a double portion of all that he has, for he is the beginning of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his. So this is a law recorded in Moses' law that is ensuring that a child is not essentially punished because of the tension and the friction that happens in these polygamous marriages. More on this in a minute, but I want to take us to Deuteronomy 25, 5 and 6. This is a very interesting passage because this passage actually looks like a command to participate in polygamy. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside of the family. Her husband's brother shall go in to her, take her as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn son which she bears will succeed to the name of the dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. This was called a levirate marriage. It was established because women in that time were dependent on men for financial security. If she was a widow and didn't have a son, some other man had to provide for her. And by marrying the brother, it kept tribes intact and preserved that family name. Now, this is a very interesting piece of history from Logos to explain why what I just read is actually music to the ears of a widow in this time period. In Hittite law and probably other ancient Near Eastern laws, a widow could be married against her will to any male relative, even to her husband's elderly grandfather or infant nephew. But Moses' law restricted her marriage to someone of roughly her age. That is, she should only marry a brother of her husband, and she was allowed to refuse. So what I read of that law in Deuteronomy, I know in our culture sounds really crazy, that you need to go marry your brother-in-law. But think about in comparison to the laws that were happening in cultures around them. That if a woman's husband died, okay, we've had the funeral, now let's go to the window of the nursery and pick out your next husband out of these babies. And by pick out, I mean the people in the tribe are picking out who you're going to marry, and you are marrying them, and it's not a choice. It makes more sense, and Moses was showing a great kindness to say, no, she needs to marry somebody age appropriate. Someone around her husband's age would make more sense because they would probably also be around her age. And also, she can say no if that's what she wants. Now, there'll be consequences. There'll be difficulties of providing at that point. But if that's what she wants to do, she should have that right to do it. We see this major elevation that God's law was bringing above the culture that they were in. That's something you find over and over in the Bible. So often I hear people act because of Paul's words to Timothy. They act as if the Bible is just this misogynistic, I don't even know. They want to call it a fairy tale book, but also say it was full of misogynistic ideas. The truth is that compared to the culture of that day and compared to the culture around the world today, the Bible definitely elevates the status of women over and over and over again. But this law that Moses had applied in Deuteronomy, it actually gets undone in the New Testament. It gets reversed by Paul in his writings to the Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 7, 39 through 40, this is a familiar passage, and I don't think people know what these verses mean because they don't know about that law. I just told you about it. They don't know about the levirate marriage, so they don't understand what Paul was actually saying. Paul said, a wife is bound by law as long as her husband lives. But if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. But she is happier if she remains as she is, according to my judgment, and I think I also have the Spirit of God. People read that passage, and it's in the context of Paul discussing whether or not people should marry and the ideas of virgins and things like that. It's in the context of that, and people don't understand how powerful those verses, these two verses are. Because Paul just gave women a lot of power. So you had these surrounding cultures in Moses' day that said, we're going to pick out grandpa for a widow to marry. And then Moses says, oh, no, you're not. They've got to be provided for. They have to be taken care of. That's true. And we need something to make sure we take care of them. And actually, if you go back in that Deuteronomy 25 passage, if you keep reading, what you're going to find is that there was a lot of shame on a man who refused to go along with this. But Moses elevates it and says, yes, they have to be provided for. There's got to be a man to take care of these women, because how can they make it without a man? However, we're going to give the woman something that makes more sense for her, and also she does have a choice. And then Paul comes in and he busts all of this out, and he says, actually, no, if she wants to get married, fine, she can choose someone. She needs to choose a believer, but she can pick somebody. But also, she doesn't actually have to remarry if she doesn't want to. She can just be single if she wants. Paul reversed the rule on a widow marrying her brother-in-law, and he lets her remarry if she wants to, and she can pick the man. Moses had elevated the widow by saying her next marriage was voluntary and to someone near her husband's age, and then Paul elevated the widow again by saying she could marry a man of her choice, but the man had to be a believer. So here's the question. Moses was still trying to take care of the women when that law was set, and they were still trying to take care of how do we meet the needs of a woman in this culture that requires a man to take care of her. So is Paul not looking out for the widows when he says, no, we're getting rid of that stipulation. We're not going to make people, feel guilt and shame if they don't agree to this. Paul puts that aside. Why did Paul change it? Because now they have a mechanism for taking care of the widow, the church. And that is why there's so much conversation in the New Testament about caring for widows and orphans, because the church replaced the archaic and ungodly practices like forced polygamy. Paul also addresses polygamy in 1 Timothy 3:2 and in Titus 1:6. Those are the passages that are talking about the requirements of a bishop, that a bishop must be the husband of one wife. This is often misinterpreted in churches, but it was most definitely talking about the practice of polygamy. He was saying you cannot have more than one wife at a time, and we can understand that if you understand more of that culture. And that brings me to our last section, the practicality and permission of polygamy. We've established that polygamy is in the Bible because polygamy was happening in their culture, the same way it happens in cultures today, but it was happening, and that's why we see description of it in the Bible, and we also see certain laws around it. But the question still becomes, why was it happening? Think about how much war we see in the Old Testament. During war, polygamy allowed women to marry who would otherwise be alone because of a shortage of men. So if there were times of war and you're seeing tens of thousands of men dying, the numbers of men and women are not adding up anymore. So there would be times where there would just be a shortage of men. Also, if they were living in these kind of cultures where it was very communal and the women were, as we would call them, sister wives today, then when men go off to war, those women weren't alone. Polygamy was allowed because of the hardship of war. However, when there was peacetime, rich men began hoarding up women, and it kept the poor men from being able to have families. So there was inequality in it even then. And understand, when I say, well, it was the hardship of war, I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying that's how they justified it. That's how they could explain why it was all right for them to go against what was clear from the garden, what was right and what was wrong. But in the end, it still left inequality in their culture. This was all normal in the Old Testament when the kingdoms were ruled by Jewish people. But what happens in the New Testament? In the New Testament, the Romans are now in control. The Romans were disgusted by polygamy, but they could also get easy divorces. So it was easy for them to be judgmental about polygamy because these guys, maybe they didn't have 3 wives at a time, but they might have 3 or 4 or 10 in a row because it was so easy to just dismiss a woman and get rid of her. That takes us back to that passage I told you at the beginning that we have used several times in the Little Notes series, and we come back to it yet again. Matthew 19:3. The Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and saying to him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?" And he answered to them and he said, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate. This has been called the foundation of creation doctrine, because some people use this as the be-all, end-all scripture to outlaw polygamy for Christians, because it clearly says from the beginning, two become one. It doesn't say three become one. It doesn't say 10 become one. It's two become one. And I will go ahead and tell you that I've seen a lot of commentaries sort of mock that as an idea. I think it's a fair assessment personally. But what matters the most here is that Jesus is saying from the beginning, it was very clear the way this was supposed to work. But something happened. Something changed. Verse 7, they say to him, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and put her away? So the same question we get of if polygamy is wrong, then why are you seeing it in the Bible? The Pharisees did the same thing to try to trap Jesus. If it was wrong, then why did Moses say, why did he give the rules for how to make the certificate of divorce? He said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. So why is there polygamy in the Old Testament and even rules on the subject, like earlier when I told you about Deuteronomy that said that if you had a wife you loved and one you didn't love, you had to treat the children still fairly. We can't punish the kids for the decision that you made as an adult. Why is that in there? It's for the same reason that the Mosaic Law addressed divorce, even though the Bible says God hates divorce, because it was a reality. God had made it clear since the garden that marriage was designed for one man, for one woman, for life. But if they refused to abide by this model, they had to understand that they were going to be held responsible for the way their decisions affected the rights of others. Having laws in place for polygamy do not equal approval of polygamy. It was never God's perfect will for marriage, and it is never presented in a positive light in Scripture. And again, I say, it becomes even the law that is used as saying, well, see, God said here for the widow to participate. That was abrogated in the New Testament because the church came, and the church was supposed to be the church. And the church was supposed to take care of people, so they didn't have to follow that anymore. I appreciate you taking your time with me. Again, this concludes our societal ethical portion of Little Notes. We will continue the Little Notes series, continuing with this apologetic approach where we try to talk about what does the Bible say, and then say how do we answer these difficult questions around these issues. But next up, we are going into a unit that's going to describe the Bible, and I think this could be a very powerful series of lessons because it can help you answer what is becoming a rising argument in the Christian community. Should we include other books in the Bible? Why have we not? Why do we listen to a bunch of old men who decided what the Bible is? That's the argument they'll give you, and I'm going to answer for you why that's the wrong conversation to be having. I appreciate you joining me, Lindsay Schreiber, for Little Notes and Big Questions. I'll see you next week.